I only read one book, but it's a good book, don't you know? I act the way I act because the good book tells me so. If I want to know how to be good, it's to the good book that I go. Because the good book is a book, and it is good, and it's a book.
And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And he did look at her, and did think that this was probably the worst threat ever devised by man. And then he did realize that it was indeed devised by woman, and so he did see that it was intended to instill within him a great feeling of guilt. But lo, Jacob was a man, and so did not giveth a toss. That was until he did realize that Rachel was strapped up with high explosives, and was stood right next to him, which did make this the first known threat of a suicide attack if the demands of the person making the threat were not met. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she did look at Jacob, and did point unto him, and say that maybe he would be in a fit state to give children, if he was not always ploughing her sister Leah, who he doth hate so much, and he did have to admit that she did have him on that one. And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her, because when a similar thing did happen with Jacob's grandparents, there were of course no unforeseen complications, and everybody involved was happy at the outcome, and Jacob did put all of this out of his mind, and instead concentrated on the offer of a threesome with the maid that his wife had just made unto him. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob, who, like his grandfather, was very keen to get to know the staff, went in unto her. And Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. And now he did have 2 out of 3 of his wives that could bear children, and it did make the one that couldn't rather miserable. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Well, he hath given Bilhah a son, that I shall take as my own. Therefore called she his name Dan, for she was desperate. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son, just to prove that it wasn't a one-off the first time. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, for Jacob did like to watch a little girl-on-girl action from time to time, and I have prevailed, and she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. For she did sit in her tent all night, looking as miserable as Rachel did, and Leah did think that it was only fair that her maid should get a bit of man action also. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son, presumably just to prove a point. And Leah said, A troop cometh, because among the 3 of them they were literally laying the foundations of the 12 tribes of Israel. And she called his name Gad, which did roughly translate as 3-0. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son, by this time just for shits and giggles. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed, because out of all of her sisters she had have 4 sons. The maids did have 2 each, and Rachel did have none. And she called his name Asher, which did translate as, Can't touch this. And Reuben, who could not have been older than 7 years, went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, which he did somehow know were used for making love potions, and did contain a number of magical ingredients, which would one day be known as delirium hallucinogenic tropine alkaloids, and would include such things as scopolamine and atropine, and would be poisonous, and brought them unto his mother Leah. And she did beam with joy when her son did give unto her a handful of toxic weeds. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. For she did either think that a love potion could be made from them, or she was just into vegetable sex. And she, that being Leah, said unto her, her being Rachel, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? Seemingly forgetting that in the previous chapter the only reason that Jacob did marry her was because he was tricked into doing so by her father, under the belief that he was actually marrying Rachel. And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Don't us be going there, girlfriend. Thou be knowing that Jacob be hating on your sorry ass right from the get-go, and it was thou who be stealing my man from me. And a catfight did ensue. And when they had finished, and were sat on the floor of the tent, their make-up smudged, their tight-fitting, horrendously coloured lycra clothing ripped and dishevelled, each one missing both a shoe and an earring, and both out of breath, Rachel did turn unto Leah and say, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. And Leah did look unto the selection of assorted root vegetables and the cucumber that otherwise would have been keeping her company that night, and did agree. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, carrying that day's newspaper under one arm and a roll of toilet tissue under the other. And Leah went out to meet him, and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And Jacob did look confused and disheartened that out of all the promising possibilities he had become the first person in the history of humanity who would be hired out and traded for sexual favours in the world's first drug deal, and so he would forever be known as the world's first rent boy. His beloved Rachel would be the first pimp, and his wife Leah would be the first punter. And he lay with her that night. And the following morning he did feel used like a common prostitute, only they were not that common, seeing as he was the first one, and more so when he did find that Leah had left him a 10-shekel tip. And God hearkened unto Leah, for he really did like making Jacob's life a misery. And she conceived, and bare Jacob the 5th son, just to piss her sister Rachel off, who was still languishing at the bottom of the table with nil point. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Ishkar, which was Arabic for speedy, which would one day be the name given to an organization well known for its tool hire. And Leah conceived again, just because she could, and bare Jacob the 6th son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And Jacob, who was by now getting a little tired of the smell of dirty nappies and stale milk, did somehow think that it was unlikely, and she called his name Zebulun, which is roughly translated from Hebrew into a language that would be known as English, as double hat trick. And afterwards she bare a daughter, and called her name Dinah, and it would one day save a lot of strife and unhappiness for her future husband, when he would point towards the kitchen and say her name, and her name was roughly translated as sandwich. And God remembered Rachel, who up to now had been somewhat forgotten, and left to seek comfort in vegetables. And God hearkened to her, and opened her wound, most likely by separating her knees. And she conceived, and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach, for finally, after many seasons, she had finally managed to get upon the score-sheet. And she called his name Joseph, and said, rather presumptuously, considering how long it had taken her to pop out just one, The Lord shall add to me another son. It came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, and to my country. For he was concerned that there may be something in the water that was turning his wives into what can only be described as mogwais that had been thrown into the river. And he did continue, Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and which you doth own. And let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee, completed as someone in indentured servitude, rather than as an employee or a close relative. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favour in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learnt by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. For though the Lord doth keep handing thee the shitty end of the stick, time after time, I, an unbeliever, doth appear to be doing quite well for myself, thus proving that the Lord doth help those that doth help themselves, and the gullible are easily separated from that is thine. And he said, Appoint me thy wages, and I will give it, hinting strongly that whatever he did appoint as wages should not be anything particularly valuable, and should, if possible, include sacks and great piles of sand, which Laban did possess in great abundance for selling unto the Arabs, which he did manage with ease. And he said unto him, Thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For Jacob's job, through all of the years that he had been with Laban, was to look after cows. For he did know that the Lord did like cows, and he did hope that this would bring him favour. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, as thou did leave the animal husbandry unto your daughter, and it is now increased unto a multitude, since a man was put in charge. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming, and now when I shall, I provide for mine own house also. Seeing as I have worked for thee for the last 14 years for 2 wives, and bugger all else. And he said, What shall I give thee? And Jacob said, Thou shalt not give me anything. For Jacob's negotiating skills were really awful, and the way that things were going, earning a big bag of pebbles every week, would have been untold riches. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. And Laban could not believe his luck, and he continued, I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep. But I will leave all other cattle there, and hopefully the sheep will not be bothered, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban was a little confused, for he did think that Jacob was removing brown cattle from amongst the sheep, and not the brown sheep, and did think that maybe he had mixed up cattle and sheep in the previous verse. And Laban, who had stopped and thought for a while, and now thought that he did have a hold on what Jacob was proposing, and guesses that he did not own all that many speckled goats and brown sheep, said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word, which made almost no bloody sense whatsoever. And he being Jacob, removed that day the he-goats that were ring-streaked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons, leaving only goats of a uniform colour, and white sheep for Laban. And Laban was very happy at having only uniform colours among his flocks, which will apparently be how those who will be known as Christians, in a place that will be called the Bible Belt of America, will feel about their flocks also, especially the ones where the members of those flocks are all white. And he presumably being one of Jacob's sons, set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks, as it was, after all, what he was being paid to do. And Jacob then set in motion a cunning plan, where he would carefully manipulate the breeding conditions of the herds, so that he could ensure that the genetic variation of things called phenotypes, which in this case include a tendency towards the coat of a goat being spotted or striped, would be more likely, so that he could increase the numbers of his own flocks. Took him rods of green poplar and of hazel and chestnut tree, and piled white strikes in them, and made the white appear, which was in the rods. Because although this book is the literal truth, it contains nothing about genetics and animal breeding such as would be understood centuries later. And he set the rods, which he had piled before the flocks, in the gutters of the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink, because in Jacob's time it was thought that the goats would produce stripy offspring if they did see stripy things, when they did drink, and they did conceive. As the people in Jacob's time did not know nothing about a thing called genetics, which would be developed many hundreds of years later, and would entirely explain why some goats have spots and some goats do not, and will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the rods that Jacob did put before the livestock to make them produce spotted and striped goats were no use whatsoever. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-striped, speckled, and spotted, which was truly unexpected, as never before had one kind of animal, such as a goat, given birth to another kind of animal, such as cattle. And lo, in the future, when those that would be known as creationists did say that a thing called evolution, by way of natural selection, did not occur because one kind has never brought forth another kind, such as a goat bringing forth a cow, then they would be utterly owned in the most righteous and pleasing way by their own book. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks towards the ring-streaked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not into Laban's cattle, which was a long-winded and confusing way of saying that he did keep all of the spotted and striped and brown lambs for himself, and did not mix the stripy goats with Laban's cows, if read literally. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods, which would have made just as much difference to how striped or streaked the offspring were, had he placed the rods, one after the other, up his own back passage. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. For it did not occur to him that two feeble cattle producing feeble offspring had more to do with them being feeble than it did with Jacob's rods, and that the rods he was waving around might as well have been a magic wand, and Jacob might as well have been the spots and stripes fairy. And Jacob, who on this occasion was the man, increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants and menservants, and camels and asses. And considering that Jacob had been messing around with breeding techniques for cows, sheep, and goats, we are left to wonder where he did get the maidservants and menservants, and camels and asses, and we are left to conclude that they were most probably the offspring of Jacob's livestock, who had been shown various different pictures. And up in heaven, the Lord, who did know everything and was everywhere, did look down upon Jacob, running around the fields with stripy and spotted twigs and waving them in front of his animals with great amusement. And it did occur to him that now would be the perfect opportunity to introduce unto this narrative, that would be by some taken as being literal, the concept of genetics, and how various characteristics which were the result of things that in centuries to come would be known as genes could be passed down and inherited by subsequent generations. And he did partake of the herb that was indeed very good, and he did sit back and contemplate that in centuries to come there would be followers of his son, who was really him, and the result of an embarrassing one-night stand he did have with his own mother, who would insist that this particular narrative is entirely consistent with a thing that shall be called science, and that things in science that would be inconsistent with this narrative should be ignored. He contemplated further that these people would use the marvellous complexity, yet deceptive simplicity, of a thing that will be known as deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short, which the Lord did come up with when he tried combining primordial and alphabet soup and got beef minestrone, as proof of the Lord's existence, yet at the same time they will cling to an insistence that the arrangement of stripy twigs has more effect on the skin colour of an animal than the arrangement of the animal's DNA. And the Lord did laugh further at the thought that although this narrative would be said to contain the literal truth of how the Lord did create the universe and everything in it, it might as well be a list of instructions on how to find the wings on a buffalo, in that they will both talk at length in surprisingly vague detail about something that does not exist. And the spots and stripes fairy did take her magic wand and her collection of stripy sticks, and did go and sulk in the corner.